Good morning and welcome to my talk. I'm going to talk about ontological foundations of collective intentionality. In this talk, I purpose to bring out the ontological foundations of collective intentionality in order to free it from the suspicions of subjective arbitrariness. The ontological foundations that I intend to show releases the notions of collective intentionality also from forms of reductionism, which lead it back to the mere sum of individual acts. To achieve my purpose, I will follow the following steps. First, I'm going to free the notions of intentionality from its psychological misunderstanding, which Husserl called with the term of psychologism. Second, I'm going to show how it is possible to accept a non-reductionist notions of collective intentionality without falling into ontological redundancies or metaphysical drifts, which hypostaze supra-individual entities of a substantial type. Third, I'm going to develop an ontophenomenology of collective intentional dynamism, showing how collective intentional acts are configured. In general, the concept of collective intentionality has to deal with that type of intentions that come into play in the different form of sharing and social interaction, and that all of us to act together, to feel the same emotions together, or to think in a common and shared way, in the etc. In the current debate, these intentions are mostly understood as psychological and mental acts or experience. Intentionality corresponds to the subjective intentions, that is, to the will to perform certain actions, to feel certain emotions, or to believe in certain contexts together with other people. From the phenomenological point of view, however, the concept of intentionality exceeds it precedes that of intentions. Before expressing a psychological and mental state of experience, the notion of intentionality expresses the essential way in which any type of consciousness can be consciousness of the reality that presents itself in front of it. That is, it expresses the idea that there can be a consciousness of the world and a word that is given to it just because having a consciousness means precisely being connected to the reality in a plot of perceptual, emotional, intuitive correlations, etc. In this sense, being conscious means being the acting pole of a fundamental correlations that inseparably binds consciousness and reality. In other words, intentionality is the transcendental conditions by which there is a certain world of facts, objects, and subject to which a conscious living being can refer in terms of reality. In a realistic framework, which is aided by Husserlian phenomenology, intentionality expresses the correlation that a subjectivity can have with the thing itself through the different modality of its possible intentional acts. An intentional act is a stance that allows the subject to be in the presence of something or someone. It is the mode through which the experiential subject takes a stand in the face of the things, being in the presence of it. There are acts of several kinds: perceptual, cognitive, linguistic, intuitive. In each intentional act, we find a fundamental structure, which is composed of the three intrinsically connected parts: a noetic pole, the subject; an intentional mode, the act; and a noematic pole, the object. As long as we talk about individual intentionality, there does not seem to be much doubt about the elements that constitute it. An individual conscious, a certain type of intentional individual act, and a given object data. For example, if I admire the sunset, I is the individual noetical pole. I admire is the intentional act that expresses the conscious mode through which I place myself in the presence of this sunset. And this sunset is the noematic pole, which offers itself to my consciousness as a sensitive, aesthetically relevant, emotionally significant data. True, exactly through my intentional acts. The problem arises by means of the following question: is there really a properly collective intentionality in which the noetic pole is not the individual but a collective that really perform collective intentional acts? If we take the previous example, I admire this sunset, and turn it into a proposition that expresses a collective experience, we admire this sunset, several ontological problems arise. About we, does it indicate a sovereign individual subjectivity, or is it nothing more than the sum of many I? About we admire, it is a truly collective intentional act which unites the many individual acts in a single and joint one, or is nothing more than the sum of many individual acts. I admire, you admire, he admires. And finally, about this sunset, can we consider it a collective data as intentional correlate of a really existing we? Or is it an individual datum that is a phenomenon that is jointly given to me, you, and him? The three problems mentioned above are rooted in the central ontological problem that animates the whole philosophical debate and precisely concern the nature of the bearer. On the one hand, there are those who believe that collective intentionality is not merely individual, that is, that the we, it is not reducible to individual subjectivity. The bearer of collective intentionality would then be the collective. On the other hand, there are those who argue that only the individual subject can be the bearer of intentionality, having a psyche and a mind of their own embodied in their own body. Consequently, collective intentionality would be nothing more than the aggregations of disjointed and independent individual consciousness. According to me, there is a third way, which is in a certain sense intermediate. This way is better in tone with common sense and at the same time offer a philosophically non-redundant version from the ontological metaphysical point of view. I could summarize it as follows. Collective intentionality is that kind of intentionality that can belong to individuals only to the extent that they are really members of a collective. In other words, collective subjects with their identity and their normative structure are the ontological conditions of existence of collective intentionality. In order to give reason for this thesis, I must first of all define what a real collective subject is, distinguish it from other forms of aggregation in which people think, feel, or act together without being part of an authentic form of social unity. When I talk about collective subject in my ontological framework, I'm not referring to any kind of social aggregates in which two or more people find themselves sharing some kind of experience. Rather, I always refer to whole of social nature, that is, to forms of social unity in which the cooperations between people respond to a precise weaving of structural and normative constraints, which make them real and proper, relatively non-independent constituent part. From my ontological point of view, a human subject is authentically member of a collective only if she is a constituent part of it, playing a role on its structural and regulatory establishment process. Such integrations always implies that people establish with each other foundational joining relationship, which have a dual power to forge bonds between the involved parties and to create emerging forms of social unity. The latter have their own normative texture on which depend a certain stratified organizations of roles and joint actions. They also have their own specific identity, which give them emerging features with respect to the characteristics of individual and their own emerging causal power, otherwise unavailable to their constituent part. Through such a relationship and within the normative plots which emerges from them, the members of the collective take a real ontological change. From independent individualities, they become relatively non-independent parts. The new conditions of non-independence concern both the horizontal relationship of dependence or codependence with the other members of the collective and the vertical relationship of dependence with the collective in its entirety. The appropriation of these twofold dimensions of consciousness is precisely the ontological foundations of what I understand properly as collective intentionality. The matrix of this unit is essentially normative: obligation, collective obligation, rights, duties, responsibility, promises, agreements, rules, laws, etc. All the other forms of cooperation or sharing, which I cannot ontologically analyze here, do not, according to me, do not give rise to social walls, but to social aggregates, and do not have so the power to found a real collective intentionality. The noetic pole of the central object is the noetic pole of collective intentionality. While in intersubjective intentionality, we find intentional acts of ontologically independent individuals. In the collective one, we find intentional acts of ontologically non-independent parts. Behind the fact that this condition is fully aware of tacitly acting, my thesis is as follows. The ontological condition of the subject define the mode of her intentional position. Her is intentional positioning. The latter is configured as a certain X intention and is declined in the following fundamental form. I intentions, which is the form of individual intentionality. The subject takes a stand toward the surrounding world in individual way, starting from his ontological or his ontological conditions of independence. As intentions, which is the form of intersubjective intentionality, several individual subject takes a stand toward the surrounding world in a shared way, maintaining their ontological position, the ontological condition of independence. And we intentions, which is the form of collective intentionality, a group of individuals takes a stand toward the surrounding world in a collective way according to the normative and structural plots that give shape and identity to the collectivity. That is, collective intentionality is not a mere psychophysical or mental faculty which can be arbitrarily activated. On the contrary, it is a fundamental mode of consciousness through which individual subjectivity interface with the world as part of a social world. Therefore, the intentional acts have their own specific and original modality, which is essentially different from that of an I intention. In addition, the we intention should not be understood as the sum of several and disjointed I intentions. This intentional mode characterizes the acts of those who think, feel, and act in a particular ontological status, the status of member belonging to a collective. In other words, it is the intentional mode that all of the thoughts, sensitivity, values, ideas of a group to take stand in the world through the coordinated and joint intentional acts of its member. To remove collective intentionality from individualistic reductionism, it is therefore not necessary to hypostatize a sovereign individual substance. Rather, it is the particular mode of consciousness-word correlation that characterizes the intentional dynamism of those who belong to a collective. The bearer of an authentic we intentions, the member, is not an ontologically disjointed subject who live in a sort of pure individuality, as if her consciousness were a closed box that acts independently of his constraints of belonging. He is always a subject who finds himself or herself in the ontological conditions of thinking, feeling, and acting as a relatively non-independent part of a social world. While the ontological foundations of individual intentionality is a subjective individuality which has the faculty to take independently stand in the world in the individual first-person perspective, the ontological foundations of collective intentionality, we intentions, is the existence of a binding social unit, which has the power to root the stances of individual subjects in their non-independence relationship, which bind them to a plural first-person perspective, the perspective of we. Recapping, if there is an intrinsic correlation between the ontological conditions of the person and the intentional dynamism of her consciousness, and if the social bonds can configure a particular ontological positioning of her, then the collective intentionality is a specific and distinctive form of intentional correlation in which the noetic pole is a subjectivity that takes collectively a position. If this is true, if the point one is true, then the noetic polarity is not integrally reducible to its psychophysical substrate. Jointly, the noematic pole of this particular intentional mode is an originally collective data. The datum of a collective intentional act is never an individually constituted and singularly significant datum. If a datum is a collective, then it is originally given to the collectivity. That is, it is constituted within by means intentional experiences and acts of collective metrics, which unfold according to an emotional and axiological sensitivity which the subject has as a member of the group. This takes place according to the collective category, values, roles, and rules. The collective characterizations of the data does not depend on the accidental projections of an individual subject that feels it, thinks it, experience as if were something shared. Its characterization is instead collective in original and irreducible way, since the data is what it is precisely because it is constituted within an intentional dynamism of collective matrix. For example, an offense that affects the collective is such from the beginning, because it is constituted as such in intentional dynamism in which the collective conscience acts. The foundations of this originally collective configuration is once again the pre-existing ontological we, within which each member is intentionally predisposed to grasp certain data as phenomena that concern after threaten the entire community. What we think, desire, feel in the we intentional form is properly and originally given to us in our experience because there is an ontological we that outlines the intentional dynamism of its establishment. As I anticipated, the intentional dynamism of consciousness always correlates a noetic pole to a noematic pole by means of a certain types of acts. Now, if there is an authentically collective intentionality by means of which authentically and originally sovereign individual data exist, then there should also be corresponding intentional acts, which are not isomorphically reducible to individual acts or to the sum of them. That is, an intentional act is a collective only if it is possible to trace an entire community that collectively takes a stand. According to me, this is possible and this really happened. When this happens, it is not the subject to integrate into her or his own individual consciousness some social references, but it is the collectivity itself that acts through individual intentionality, having integrated them into a web of collective references, values, beliefs, goals, feelings. Only from these concatenations of collective references can arise the plots of collectively corresponding, coordinated, and joint acts. The word collectivity sees through the eyes of its constituent part. It feels through the joint emotional acts of those who compose it. It thinks through the cognitive acts of its member in which the plot of their codependence bonds shine through. The group's beliefs and values configure the members' acts according to a certain behavioral modality and guide them according to certain context. Moreover, in many cases, the member acts are governed by the constraints that characterize its positioning within the group. The reactions to a collective offense will be quite different if the member is the leader of the group or he or is in a subordinate position. The intentional dynamics that characterize the member response is so integrally different from that which characterize a reactions as a singular and independent individual. The non-independence conditions of her or him radically change the dynamism and context of the heart. What remains to isomorphism is only the psychophysical individuality of the subject X. However, it could be again possible to argue that there is no collective intentionality anyway, because X brain is and remain the brain of an individual subject without becoming the brain of a collective body. We can once again find the answer in a non-reductionist perspective, that is, understanding consciousness as the emerging dynamism of a mind which is formed from the brain, but which is not reducible to it. The brain is surely the physical support of the mind, but during its development, the mind is configured as an emerging dimension with its own characteristics and power, which are irreducible to the mere psychophysical layer. So it is the truth that a brain is always and only individual, but it is also possible that an individual brain can be the physical substrate for a collective mind being governed by values, ideas, responsibility that are defined by a certain social belonging. Individual brains thus become the bearer of a collective intentionality. The dynamism allows the collective intentional dynamism, allows the collective consciousness to take a stand in the world through the intentional acts of its member. In my opinion, the alleged isomorphism between the individual brain and the collective consciousness is clearly broken here. It is no longer the individual in his ontological dependence who takes a stand on reality, but the collective. In other words, between an individual and a group member, there is an ontological difference, which results in two intentional modes or modality of relationship with the world, which are radically different, even if the individual and the member in question are the same subject in the flesh. In conclusion, removed from forms of psychologism and reductionism, collective intentionality appears as an essential dynamism of human consciousness, which is different from the merely individual and intersubjective one. Its ontological foundation is all those forms of emerging social unity in which the interconnection between horizontal constraints, the constraints between the constituent parts, and vertical constraints, the bonds of all parts with the whole, give people an authentic ontological status of belonging. The singular individualities, each of which is endowed with its own brain and its own corporeality, thus become bearers of an intentional, collectively constituted mental dimensions. This intentional dynamism unfolds in a plurality of ontologically collective experience, acts, and actions. Thank you very much.